If we were on a road trip, this would be the time that we get back on the main highway. For the past several weeks, we have taken an exit, traveled down a beautiful road to look at Jesus' teaching on prayer. Now we merge back onto the main highway, in this case, the Sermon on the Mount. As we make our way tonight to Matthew chapter 6, verse 16, it's good to take a moment to review the context of tonight's lesson. We go all the way to Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, where Jesus said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Then in verses 2 through 18, Jesus pointed to this teaching with three different examples. Matthew chapter 6 verse 2 says, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be monitored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Then to Matthew chapter 6 verse 5, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Finally, to Matthew chapter 6 verse 16, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." Jesus confronted the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. We have looked at the teaching on giving, the teaching on praying. And so now tonight we turn our attention to Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, where Jesus teaches about the importance of true fasting. So we pick up in verse 16. "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." Fasting was a common part of the religious system of the day in Jesus' time. In Jesus' parable of the Pharisee and tax collector, remember, the Pharisee boasted that he fasted twice a week. Now, the Expositor's Bible Commentary notes that only the pious leaders fasted twice a week. I think that helps us understand Jesus' teaching, especially considering the way he introduced that parable of the Pharisee and tax collector in Luke chapter 18, verse 9. "To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable." Religious leaders, confident of their own righteousness. Pharisees, looking down on others. Jesus' teachings in Matthew chapter 6 confronted these hypocritical acts of righteousness. He gave three examples: giving, praying, and fasting. By the way, do you notice a key word that's used in chapter 6, verse 2, verse 5, and verse 16? Because if we aren't careful, it is one that we could easily overlook. It's the word when. Jesus did not say, if you give, if you pray, if you fast. Jesus said, when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. Now, sometime back, our family was discussing fasting, and I remember Abby bringing up this point. She said, "Daddy, why are you going to talk about fasting? We don't do that anymore. And I have to admit, she's right. We don't practice fasting. Now, when we got to that point of giving in the early part of Matthew chapter 6, we could dive straight into the teaching of that because we understand and we practice giving today. We were immediately able to dive into deeper teaching on praying because we are a people who understand and practice praying today. But I do not think that we can approach our study of fasting in the same manner because it's like Abby said, it's not something that we do today. Now, the topic of fasting has emerged in recent years, but mainly in the context of dieting and weight loss. The Mayo Clinic offers this explanation. Intermittent fasting is an eating style that some people use to help control their weight. You follow an eating schedule every day, only consuming food during a set number of hours during a specific window of time, and then fast for the remaining hours. We want to be careful not to confuse this intermittent fasting or anything like that. Fasting is a method of weight loss, and then the fasting that's described in Scripture, because there are two different motives, two different methods with two different outcomes. As we look in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, I think the first thing I would remind us is that, well, food is good. Genesis 1:29, then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And then to Genesis chapter 9, verse 1. Notice this is after the flood. Chapter 9, verse 1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. God has provided a wealth of food, nuts from the trees, fruits and vegetables from the ground, livestock, and more. God has blessed us with a wide range of choices to satisfy our appetites. We have the opportunity to eat a meal for nourishment and to enjoy it. We have the blessing of enjoying the food we eat. Now, in my lifetime, I have to acknowledge we have talked very little about fasting or gluttony. Perhaps it's because that we live in the land of plenty. History seems to be describing my generation as a people of excess. Every pleasure of life, whether good or bad, has been practiced to the extreme. And that is why, for instance, obesity in our country has exploded in the past few decades. Now, preachers have been selective about their application of verses like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, and then chapter 6, verse 20. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16 says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? Then to chapter 6, verse 20. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And we talk about the dangers of smoking, drinking, sexual immorality, and so many other things, but yet we often ignore the very issue that's getting out of hand. You know, it's one thing to take care of our bodies physically. Teaching is clear on that in Scripture. But what about fasting? And that's our question for tonight. So I want us to do this, take these final minutes of our lesson to answer two questions. First, I want us to look at what does the Old Testament teach about fasting? As Jesus told that group, he said, when you fast, he was talking about a group of people that lived under the Old Testament law. So I think that's where we can gain some good insight. Then number two, what about today? Is it taught that Christians should fast today? And what benefit is there for Christians to fast today? Now, for all the discussion and practice of fasting among religious leaders, under Old Testament law, there was only one day each year that the people were commanded to fast. That was the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16. It was described as a somber day. The Israelites were reminded of their sins. The high priest went into the most holy place, offered sacrifices for his sins and the sins of the Israelites. Leviticus chapter 16 verse 31 says, "It is a day of Sabbath rest, and you must deny yourselves. It is a lasting ordinance." That's a key phrase there. You must deny yourselves. The New King James Version and other versions say, "You shall afflict your souls." A complete description of that phrase will help us understand that this was to be a day of fasting. But much more. Was fasting with a purpose. Remember that phrase, fasting with a purpose. It's important in our study as well. The Day of Atonement may have been the only commanded day of fasting, but it wasn't the only day that we are given in Scripture when the people abstained from food for spiritual purposes. The Israelites observed a period of mourning in 1 Samuel chapter 31 following the death of the nation's first king, Saul. The Jews were returning from captivity in Ezra's day. He led an effort to rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed when the city of Jerusalem was overtaken. The people had been humbled. Ezra chapter 8 verse 21 describes part of the rebuilding process of a nation. "There by the Ahava Canal I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for a safe journey for us and our children with all our possessions." The companion book, if you will, to Ezra is the book of Nehemiah. Now, it also seems that Ezra was quick on hand to be part of that rebuilding, not just of the wall, but of the spiritual lives of the Israelites. Nehemiah, though, was hundreds of miles away when he first heard that news about the destruction of Jerusalem, that the walls were torn down, the people were in disgrace. Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 4 describes Nehemiah's reaction to the news that he had received. "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." One more Old Testament passage, Isaiah chapter 58. Now, this is a fairly lengthy teaching, and it gives us an indication that even in the Old Testament, there were problems associated with fasting. As I look at these first 7 verses, I keep thinking about what's a good title for that. In many of our Bibles, the title for this section has been given True Fasting. But I think in the midst of it, it's discussing problems with fasting and then how to correct those problems and really what God desires from his people. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 58, beginning in verse 1. "Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, You do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? And when you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Wow, what an incredibly strong teaching. That what Scripture's saying there is the Lord saying, and you may do this for one day at a time, but the way that you're treating one another, the way you treat the least of these, what you're doing beyond just this moment, it doesn't measure up. It's not consistent. This is a powerful teaching, and I think one that helps us understand that whatever our act of righteousness might be, the important that our lifestyle is consistent with that which we read in Scripture and we're trying to live out in whatever that may be, whether it was giving, praying, or fasting. Now, when we turn to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 4, Jesus fasted. In Acts chapter 13, church leaders fasted. That's the time that Saul and Barnabas were sent off on the first missionary journey. So with that said, is it commanded in the New Testament? Is there a thou shalt fast verse? I haven't found it. Was fasting practiced in the New Testament? Yes. Both by Jesus and the early church. Does that mean there would be benefit for us to study it more? I think definitely so. Sellers Crane has written the Matthew commentary for the Truth for Today, and in the section of chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, he gives 4 just good reasons to look deeper at this topic of fasting. And I want to share those with you as we close our time together. The first thing he suggests is to humble ourselves in God's sight. I think that's a great lesson for us, that part of the idea of fasting is a part of humility, of humbling ourselves in God's sight. Second, to dedicate, this is a great opportunity to dedicate a specific concern about which we need to pray. Third, to put spiritual matters first in our lives. This is an issue of priority, where fasting can help us to become less attracted to the things of this world, more attracted to God and to spiritual concerns. And then fourth, to increase our self-control and our ability to withstand temptation. Fasting can lead to improved self-control, and improved self-control can lead to spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity leads to a greater intimacy, a closer relationship with God. So when we read about fasting, words like lamenting, sorrow over sin, and humility, those are going to be words that rise to the top. And this will be the connecting point from our lesson tonight and the beginning of our study next week. Because I want us to look at some biblical examples, some biblical reasons for fasting, and contrast those with what Jesus saw in the religious leaders of his day. So I want to encourage you next week to join us as we continue this study into Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, where Jesus said, "And when you fast."